I'm going to call the meeting to order. Welcome to all of you. We haven't seen most of you for a while, and it's good to see you all again. And I think this is one of the first times I've seen some of you without a mask on, so not sure how long that will last. COVID around the world seems to be back in action again, so, you know, enjoy it while it lasts. We might all be back mask wearing in a month or two. So, East-West mobility. You've got a rough agenda. I'm wondering if I should, no, actually I don't need to go and stand up the front. We've got a podium there for the other speakers who are going to speak, but I think I'll just take it from here. Just a brief reminder of where we are, and then I'll introduce our colleagues from VHB. We started the study last year. We divided it into two phases. It's slightly unusual the way we divided it up. So just to recap where we are. Phase one of the study, we worked on, first of all, quantifying the problem, identifying the needs, and looking at multimodal problems and solutions. So we looked at roadways that in 2050 are going to be completely congested. Where are those, and how are we going to deal with them? Hey, Chuck. We then looked at transit. How could transit help us deal with the two metrics that we're looking at in the study, accessibility and congestion being the two issues that we focused on, and looking at then how transit could play into that. And then we also looked at bike and pedestrian issues of east-west mobility concerns, and looked at where would we need multi-use paths. And so we looked at access to train stations, and we looked at connecting existing bike and pedestrian facilities to make them work as a network, rather than what has happened over time is that portions of trails and paths and sidewalks have been built, but they aren't always connected, and we're trying to connect that so that there's a network. Phase one we completed recently, and just would like to welcome my former colleague Matthew Lehane, who did a lot of the hard work in putting phase one together, and he doesn't any longer work for us at FAMPO, but he's visiting as a guest today. So if you didn't like phase one, don't blame me, blame Matthew. Seriously though, we are happy to have Matthew visiting today. And the end of phase one concluded with a very defined list of roadways that we were going to investigate, 13 of them. A defined set of transit problems we were going to investigate, and a defined set of bike and pedestrian problems that we were going to investigate. And we worked in phase one on the transit portion of the study, looking at where would we want to put transit. We then got some feedback from Fred that they are working on their transit strategic plan, and asked us not to, I suppose, tread on their toes in terms of their plan to study a complete new route network. So when we moved to the end of phase one, we did not get into a lot of detail on the full route network of Fred, because we didn't want to upstage their transit strategic plan. So we identified some specific transit interventions that Fred was happy for us to continue working with. And we looked at, first of all, some general metrics that would help them of how do we get transit access to the train stations. And we didn't produce final conclusions. We just did the data analysis, drew some potential maps of where we thought transit would make the most sense to access those train stations, and Matthew helped us with that. And then we decided on some more detailed work on looking at a high-frequency, higher-speed transit route in some of the denser parts of the community, and a future transit transfer center in Stafford County which is planning their new downtown, their Stafford downtown area. Where would we locate such a facility to enable people to transfer between buses? We then concluded phase one, and we contracted with VHB to take us onto the phase two of this project. And their brief is to analyze what we did in phase one and give us an opinion on that, to look at then a high-level analysis of the region and tell us what they think about the future bottlenecks, looking at, on the roadways, possible additional access points that have been requested by the city and Spotsylvania to get onto or off the I-95, whether those would be a good idea, but a very high-level analysis on that, not a build a, X number of feet wide access ramp at this kind of an angle on that particular corner, not that kind of a design and engineering thing, but an analysis of what is appropriate. VHB also, thankfully, was the consultant that was in charge of the pipeline studies that VDOT had commissioned. And you will remember that one of those pipeline studies was on Route 3, and they pointed out to us in that study that we have essentially run out of cheap, easy fixes for Route 3. It is congested, and all of the fixes from here on forward are going to be larger projects. And so we've asked them to think about that when they look at these potential new access points to the I-95, and to try and give us an overall picture of what's good and bad. Secondly, we asked them to look at these 13 roadway corridors, which are going to be problematic in 2050, and then to look at this potential high-capacity, high-frequency transit route, a transit transfer center in Stafford County, a bike path in Central Park and Spotsylvania Town Center that would connect the Fall Hill, sorry, did I say transit? I meant multi-use path, I beg your pardon. That would connect the multi-use path on Fall Hill Avenue and the one on Count Boulevard through the shopping district, to look at this new bridge that VDOT has thankfully erected for us to replace the old bridge, Chatham Bridge, that was crumbling. It now is a great multi-use path across the bridge, but on either end of the bridge, we want to make sure that that bridge connects into the other networks that exist, or perhaps put a new bike path on the Stafford side of the river if that's a good idea, to look at connecting both bike and transit to the Brook, is it Brook or Brook Road train station? Brooks train station. How do you get there with a bicycle or with a bus, right? And how should you get there with a bicycle and a bus? And can that work to try and facilitate multimodal connections to there, and also the Spotsylvania train station? How do we get bicycles to the train station? And so we looked at possible route alignments, and VHB is going to have a look at that for us. The Fredericksburg train station, we've kind of removed from their remit because it's now the subject of a smart scale application. So we don't want VDOT to do the engineering and then we ask VHB to design it for us. That would be a bit pointless to double the work. So that's kind of where we are today. I think that's a good, just quick summary for everybody. VHB are now charged with doing the phase 2 of this project, which is all of what I've just described to you, analyzing and evaluating what we've done in the past, a high-level analysis of some of these roadway problems, then a detailed analysis of a list of specific projects, which we've asked them to attend to, and then at the end of this project, they're going to do the preliminary engineering, they're going to include a detailed cost analysis, and they're going to help us prepare a range of these projects for smart-scale readiness so that we have a bunch of projects to choose from when the next round of smart-scale happens in 2 years' time. We've got a battery of projects. These are the ones we can use. They're ready-made. They've got a costing. They've got some drawings. They've got all the things we need for smart-scale already prepared to a level that VDOT would consider acceptable at our local district, and I think that's going to be great for us to have that. So we've got two gentlemen from VHB in the room and some more folks from VHB online. The black suit on my right-hand side over there is Daryl Smith, and Daryl will introduce himself, but Daryl is a transit specialist, having worked for Amtrak, having worked in a number of states, having worked on BRT, having worked on rail, having worked on local bus initiatives, and he's going to be talking to us today about those transit projects we've asked VHB to deal with. Next to him over there is Chris. Chris, I've just forgotten your surname for a second. Daly. And Chris is the project lead on this whole project, so he's from VHB, and we've got Drew Morrison online, who is the deputy, I think, project manager is what you call him as well, and I'm not sure who else from VHB is online just participating, but thank you guys for coming down. I'm going to now hand over to them, and they're going to introduce this phase of the project, which is analyzing what we've done on transit and making some good recommendations that we can actually implement. And then they'll talk to us again about the next phase, dealing with the roadway portion and how we're going to do that, and just the general timelines that we're looking at there. So I'm going to hand over to the guys from VHB. I think Daryl is up first with first round of project today, if you like, or have I got it wrong? Chris, you want to?
No, you got it.
Over to you guys.
All right, well, thanks everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. This is my first in-person presentation since kind of historic for me.
We've got the box of eggs here already.
So anyway, so we'll talk about transit. We're really going to pick up where Matthew and the FAMPO staff left off with Tech Memo 4A. I'm going to assume everyone's read that, but when you remember it, it's top of mind. It probably isn't. So I'll try to give you a little bit of reminders as we go, but I'm going to leap right into where we're headed. What we've seen, what we think makes sense, and we really want your feedback today on what we've come up with. And if you see something, you go, well, what about this? What about that? Please ask. Don't hesitate to ask as I go through it. I don't mind interruptions. It's fine. Just let me know. See how well this remote mouse works. Here we go. All right. So we'll start with the East-West Priority Transit. And the first thing I wanted to do is sort of go over, so there's been this term BRT thrown about, right? Bus Rapid Transit. There are probably as many definitions for bus rapid transit as there are bus rapid transit lines running in the United States of America. So everyone has a different feel for it. And a lot of times we associate it with big cities and big systems. And I've pulled this example because it's a good example of that it doesn't have to be. So this is in Fort Collins, Colorado. It's called the MAX. Transit system's called Transport. It's basically just a 6-mile, one-way service, 5.9 miles are dedicated lanes. So about halfway has dedicated lanes. So it's a pretty good system. It's about, the service area population I have down here, the urbanized area has 264,000. The service area itself for the transit system is 164,000. So not out of range for where we are in Fredericksburg. One difference is that about half the population is in the downtown central area of Fort Collins. So it is denser in downtown Fort Collins. But what does that mean? So this little system traditionally runs about every 10 to 15 minutes. Since COVID, it's been running every 20 minutes. And it carried 4,500 people, 4,600 people a day on weekdays. So a very high volume of ridership, short distance, very high density. It connects their downtown transit center with what they call their South Transit Center. So basically they're funneling people from one side of the area to the other, and they're sort of push them through on this BRT in order to get the ridership on it. So this becomes sort of the central corridor of the transit system. I want you to keep that in mind as I go. But this is a small system. I think it's something like 7 buses it takes to run this thing. So it's not, they didn't go through this massive thing to build it. So what really guides it is what's it take to get federal money. It is a very competitive process. probably very challenging to get, but you at least have to meet the definition of what the feds call rapid transit in order to get small starts funding. So small starts is part of the capital investment grant program that's under the FTA governance. Project has to be less than $100 million in federal funding. It can't be more than $300 million in total. There are two definitions of BRT. They have corridor-based and fixed guideway-based. So fixed guideway means you have a dedicated lane. It can be a turn lane as well, so you are allowed to have turn lanes move into it. But it's essentially 4 buses, and it's something that I think most people think about, oh, bus rapid transit, it's kind of like a train, it's got its own guideway, it's doing its own thing. There aren't a whole lot of those running in the United States. Most are more of what this corridor-based BRT is, which is, it's a specially branded bus. It's nice. It's not a normal bus stop. It's a nicer, station, and it generally has priority through intersections. So it does. So to get federal funding, you do not have to have dedicated lanes. There's a myth out there that may have to be. You don't have to have that. The other criteria, as I mentioned, so these stations have to be ADA accessible. It's got to have some sort of shelter. It's got to have real-time passenger information. Has to be faster travel time through congested intersections, so that's that priority. Relatively short headway, so that's the time between trips that the buses arrive. So it has to be either every 15 minutes all day on weekend, or 10 minutes in the peak periods and 20 minutes in the off-peak, so you get your choice. It has to run at least 14 hours on weekdays and 10 hours on weekends. And then lastly is this brand thing that I mentioned before. So it has to be a consistent separate brand on the vehicles and on the stations and all the materials you put out. Any questions so far? Everyone kind of gets what BRT is? Go ahead.
Actually, just a point of personal curiosity. So for the example in Fort Collins, did they do a bus network redesign in conjunction with the implementation of that corridor?
They did over time. So yeah, because they did design it so that the transit system is funneling.
Yeah, because I know that can be an effective way to encourage ridership onto one corridor, is saying, okay, everything's going to basically off of that one.
Absolutely. And if you think about it, it makes sense, right? If you're going to put the investment in, put the infrastructure in, why would you not take advantage of that rather than having buses competing with each other on parallel routes? All right, keep going. So in the previous work, there were some assumptions on what this service was going to look like. They make the definition. So, staff did a good job. Matthew, nice job. Made the federal definition. So we've actually ended up with 14 hours of service on weekdays, 13 on weekends, on Saturdays, and then 10 on Sundays, every 15 minutes throughout the day, 7 days a week. In definition, you can actually take it down to 30 minutes on weekends, so which I wouldn't really consider good service, but you can do it. And the travel times that we're assume transit signal priority. I'll get a little bit into that later. With the downtown terminus at the VRE station, either at the station itself or by going around the block on Lafayette. So we ended up looking at coming up with 4 different alternatives from the 6 that were evaluated previously. And what we looked at was, when we looked at all 6 different models, and there were different routings throughout, some staying on 3, some going all the way up to Fall Hill, some staying on Cowan. We looked at all 3, and what we saw was there were 3 major points driving everything. There's downtown and the VRE station. There's Mary Washington University. And there's 4. There's the hospital, and then there's all of this retail development centered on the Walmart over at Central Park. Okay? And then this is my constant joke, so you have to know this. I really do believe someone, maybe Matthew will do it for Foursquare, but there should be a paper about the relationship between Walmarts and transit, because wherever I've gone to do work across this country, you can guarantee high ridership at the Walmart. Some magic connection there. No exception here. So those are the areas. And we also looked at, okay, there's other opportunities with these 2 park and ride lots at Salem Church and Gordon Road, Salem Church and Gordon Road out here.
Daryl, just before you move off that point, because not everybody may understand this, the model predicts that the highest ridership comes around the Walmart facility. That's the point. The point is that they've actually modeled where the highest ridership will be to get on and off a bus, and by far, Walmart produces the highest ridership of people getting on and off the bus, and that's important to understand.
So we ended up with 4 alternatives. They're all basically on this same corridor that I'm showing here. So what we're suggesting is coming up through downtown Fredericksburg on the Princess Anne and Caroline Street, one-way pair, using William Street to then cut over to the University at Stafford, and then following that to Cowan along till it becomes Central Park, dipping down into the town center, coming back up on Bragg, across onto 3, and then this one we would end at Salem Church. So this one does not directly serve the hospital, and it does not continue on to Gordon Road, okay? Oops, the next one, same route, we're just continuing it all the way out 3 to Gordon Road in order to serve that park and ride lot out there. The next one, the next 2, but this one, the third one, we actually make this deviation from the Fred Center here, going up Emancipation to work our way into Mary Washington Hospital, and then coming around on Sam Perry and then back out to Cowan, and then following that route. And then the 4th alternative was just to bring us all the way out, again, to the Gordon Road Park and Ride lot. Any questions on those 4 options? Centered on the same thing. Basically, the questions we're asking ourselves are, is Gordon Road worth going all the way out there, and does it make sense to serve deviate to serve the hospital or not?
Central Park, you guys chose Central Park Boulevard and Bragg Hill rather than, I think it's Carl D. Silver Parkway.
Yep.
What's the thought there?
It just seemed more central when we looked at all the where all the ridership was congregating, and relatively doable walks, to either side in order to get everything that's in there.
And Walmart's on Central Park.
Yeah, and Walmart's there as well.
But it is not at that.
Correct, it's off a little bit up.
And so is a lot of new residential, a tremendous amount of residential to the north, so anything that would, be able to help those people access would be beneficial.
And it's something to remember is that with any fixed route transit service like this, right, which, today, the beauty of the Fred network is that it deviates, right? The bus will go off and go pick somebody up to 3/4 miles away and then come back. Something that's going to be more rapid, which is what we're going for here, isn't going to do that. People are going to have to come to it. So that is, as kind of Nick was alluding to and Ian was alluding to, when you start thinking this through, we're looking at just one route. In order for whatever we come up with to be truly successful, it's going to take the supporting network to pull it off. You can't just assume one route's going to do it all. Nick and then Andrea.
And another thing, I noticed in the assumptions you had a weekday start time of 6:30, and I would worry that a system that starts that late in the morning might miss some of the key morning commute traffic to the VRE station.
Yeah, and I would say that the times we held those times for now just in order to compare the options. But I think when we issue the final recommendation, we're going to definitely tweak those times. Show you some things here. I would definitely say that on the weekends, 15 minutes is far too frequent for what the demand is going to be. So that that's an easy way to save some money on the operating costs. But yeah, we're looking at the time of day, coordinating with the VRE departures, all of that should be in before something became actually running, all of that needs to be brought in.
We've made it clear to BHB that we would like them to come up with a set of metrics that is probably going to work practically in our region. So this particular first analysis used the same metrics that we used in phase 1, but they are going to actually change those slightly to produce a final recommendation of this is what we actually think is going to work best in the end, which will change the service time slightly. It will change the when to do 15-minute headways or 20-minute headways or 30-minute headways and all that kind of thing. So the final recommendation will be slightly different to this.
So in terms of walkability, I think if you're looking at walkability to the hospital the same way you're thinking of walkability at Central Park, cutting over to Route 1 to me seems like a disaster. I mean, because if from Cowan, you can walk to the hospital. It's not that bad. There's sidewalks and everything.
It's about a half mile, and so the comfortable walk is usually around a quarter mile. You definitely start losing people once you get past the quarter mile is about a 5-minute walk, half mile is about 10 minutes. So and somewhere in between there is when things start falling off.
I agree, but I'm just saying that if you're thinking by those same metrics at Central Park and at the hospital, then Cowan seems like definitely the better alternative.
Well, one option to potentially mitigate that, conflict is a system that has branches. So maybe there's a higher frequency of service between VRE and the hospital, and maybe 1 out of every 2 buses terminate at the hospital, and then the other half of the buses continue down all the way to Route 3. And, maybe because if there's a lower level of service demand out that way, and, you combine them in the core for a really frequent 10-minute or 7-minute headway or something like that.
And I'll show you when we get to the ridership why, where we've come out on that and on our preliminary ridership. But I will say that this is only, a 6 to 7 mile line, so you really don't want to end up with too much complication. You really want it to be, best practice is everything does the same thing all the time so that you don't have passengers confused on, can I get on this bus or not? You really want it to be just instinctive with what people can do. Yes, sir.
There is a downtown shuttle that would intersect with this BRT. I'm thinking out loud here, is what kind of potential you think there could be for a hospital shuttle and a sort of a Central Park shuttle that sort of loops, connects, intersects with this? Because I get the expeditiousness of wanting to go down Cowan, and I get that it's a half-mile walk, but maybe trying to hit both bells or something like that.
So there's 2 pieces there. So one is we've talked about that. There are going through in Central Park, because it's so spread out and it's so many different destinations, something like that would probably make sense. With the hospital, you're going to see kind of where we've seen some of the ridership differences. It's pretty significant. And the general rule of thumb is, because we Americans, we like to put our behinds in one seat and not get out of it again, that any time that you force a transfer, so make me get out of that seat, get in another seat, you lose half the ridership. So every transfer cuts your ridership in half. So something that we want to be really careful of. And I will tell you, I have looked at that in real world examples, both in transit and at Amtrak, and it always comes out somewhere between 49 and 51% of the market's lost when you force that ridership. So it is a very good rule of thumb.
I guess I'm thinking of it, though, that the downtown shuttle is operational today and has a reason to exist apart from this. And I can see that a shuttle system in the hospital has a reason to exist. Daycare, the urology offices to connect, the whole campus. Similarly, from the roundabout at the stadium all the way down, Central Park down to the Burger King. I mean, that's a whole corridor of a loop would have a reason to exist regardless. So I agree with you. If it's only in context of this proposal, it is maybe pushing the envelope. But I see viability for all 3 of those elements apart from this, even if this doesn't happen.
And that I would agree with, and I think that's the right way to think about it. Is would something like that exist on its own or serve its own purpose? And that's exactly right. And that's, as Ian alluded to, that's something that the folks at FRED are looking at overall. So that's a bit separate from what we're doing. So we're focused on this order. So, and believe me, it takes everything in me not to start redesigning the FRED network, because I would love to do that. But that's not our task.
They are in the process of doing that, and they will take work that we've done in this study and boil it into the FRED TSP process.
Yes.
I
had a question. This is really great. Thank you for presenting this. I see that most of these routes do a pretty good job of avoiding congested areas, but I can't help but notice they all go through the same stretch between the mall and Salem Church Road that's terribly congested. Are you worried that running your rapid buses through a congested section of highways is going to slow the whole system down?
Yes and no, but hold the thought. And when I get to that slide and I say, this is how we're going to get around it, you can say, you're crazy or not. That works. Okay. So we ended up looking at several different ridership markets, as I alluded to. So we did look at the park and ride market. Fred did run a service in the past. So in the historic ridership figures from 2015, they were averaging about 150 passengers a day between the two park and ride lots, between Salem Church and Gordon Road. So, you know, we have a number to go from on that. It was one of my big questions of how many people are really going to do that. So it's been done, and there is a good number there. Big one is Mary Washington University with 2,200 students living on campus. Campus ridership on transit is usually a very positive thing when it's offered. There are a number of different strategies to make that work, including adding a student fee so they get unlimited rides on whatever that transit system is. That is something we would definitely say if you want to go this route, we want to try to pursue a partnership with the university in order to make that happen. 4,400 students total, 203 faculty, just a good solid base to be working from. The hospital as well, there's 4,500 employees between the two hospitals, so over half of them are at this one. Another really solid market. I talked about Walmarts before. Hospitals also are generally high ridership generators, in part because of the types of staff they employ. So that's another thing to watch for. But as Nick was alluding to, it's also one you have to watch when you run the service, because hospital shifts are working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So you can't only serve them 5 days and then, you're on your own for Saturday. That doesn't work. So it can be expensive to serve hospitals. In the new multifamily apartment developments that are going around this quarter, there are 1,554 new units coming online. So there's also a high-density population that is coming in that typically is more likely to use transit than not.
Stephen, just if I could interrupt a second, Stephen mentioned the new construction further north towards the river. Yes, there is even more, but the problem is that when you do that, you either then have to go down Fall Hill Avenue or you got to come back from going out there. It creates another loop. And we discovered in the numbers, even Matthew found that before we got to VHB, that Fall Hill Avenue doesn't generate as many riders as Cowan Boulevard in practice. So, well, according to the model, I should say, not in practice. So that's the trade-off. You've got to decide, which of those markets do you want to serve? And you might not, with the one BRT route, be able to serve both. You might need another Fred route to connect to the BRT or something. I don't know. I don't have the answer, but that's definitely something that wasn't ignored.
When the map was there, could you go back?
Sure.
Just something that's, if you did this, so this could come here, have a stop here, come back, by the Walmart, and then, but this doesn't exist yet.
Right.
That's what it would probably take to get you over there without putting a terrible interruption in, but it would be a similar thing to what you're doing at the hospital.
So is VDOT committing to build us a road out there so we can do that?
We have another smart code.
I'm certainly qualified to say absolutely.
You heard it here first, folks.
Right after I retire, I'll start.
So we're still, take all these numbers with a grain of salt. We are continuing to refine the model called T-Best to run new numbers. But as we looked at what was done before and we think through supplementing some of that through these other markets that I mentioned, this is about where we're coming out. So from the prior runs, looking at the best values at each stop, You know, that's what this first row is. So basically, somewhere, as you see, when we're not serving the hospital, around 783 passengers, plus we add on 75 riders per park and ride lot. So up 150 total if we serve both Gordon Road and Salem Church, 75 if we just serve Salem Church.
If you're battling to see the slide, we will make these available to everyone who's in the room and folks online as well afterwards, so you don't need to sit and write down every single number. We will make the slides available.
And then we looked at, okay, so we have this university very conservatively estimating 10% of the resident students to use it a day. That is extremely conservative. There are wide ranges. My favorite, University of Florida, actually has just about every student riding every day, but the campus is so spread out, you're kind of required to ride the shuttle system because it doesn't really have, you don't really have a choice. So we figure, okay, for this comparative purpose, that's probably a good way to make it out. We were very surprised, well, I can't say surprised, impressed with the ridership at the hospital because you can see what happens. Our 783 on our first two options goes up to 989 on the hospital option. So the hospital is generating about 200 more passengers a day, which makes sense for the size of the hospital, something just shy of 10% of that population, that employee population. That makes sense to us, so that felt good. So I mentioned, you know, the park and ride generates some ridership, but in the scheme of things, it's not a lot, right? So by the time we total up, we're dealing with a low of 1,000, you know, just over 1,000 going to Salem Church via, you know, not serving the hospital, to a high of 1,359 serving the hospital and going all the way out to Gordon Road.
Per day, riders per day.
Weekday. You can also see that the numbers don't do much on the weekends. So this, you heard me say earlier, I probably don't need to do 15-minute service on the weekends. Something that we are going to look a little further at is what's the university's potential on the weekends. You know, would those students actually get out and ride a bus on the weekends to do everything they're doing, or are they just going to stay on campus, or do they just flee and go do something else? You know, we'll look at that a little closer. So in any case, you know, on an annual basis, you're talking about somewhere between 286,000 and 358,000 passengers a year. So it's not what I showed you at the beginning with Max, but it's nothing to sneeze at either. It's a reasonable level of ridership for a decent service.
Daryl, quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Does the model, is it sensitive enough to take into consideration the cost of parking? And whether there's a, okay.
No, and that was one of our challenges, even looking at the park and ride. Why we supplemented it is because the market was not recognizing park and ride at all.
Yeah.
So one of the things we did talk about is, okay, so if you ended up with paid parking at the hospital, paid parking downtown, that would clearly drive something different. The model's not real good.
Okay, yeah, because that was one of the things I was going to recommend exploring is, theoretically, if the hospital charged some market rate parking for all their employees, you know, what would that do to the ridership?
But I would also say in the market today, it's not a paid parking environment. Mm-hmm. My guess is that they wouldn't want to because they're going to chase off potential employees, right? You generally don't want to do that when you're competing for employees. And like so many places right now, hospitals are competing.
Yeah.
They would probably charge customers and not staff for parking if they ever did.
Yeah.
We had a question from a previous slide, what was considered other general travel?
Oh, sure. Okay. So that is the one right before this. Scroll over. All right, so the other general travel is what we're capturing in the model. Okay, so sorry, I just kind of skimmed that over. So there is a lot of just core ridership. That's what Fred is picking up today. So there are a lot of people that depend on transit. Give them a better option. Two things is, one, they're going to choose to go somewhere on this service, and second is they're going to ride more often because, hey, it runs every 15 minutes, not once an hour. That's a whole lot different story. I think I'll go do that trip. I wouldn't normally do it. Or, yeah, I can go to Walmart today and then go to the mall tomorrow and not try to work it into one trip because it's just too painful otherwise. So we start looking at some statistics on how this thing works. So we cross the 4 options, same 114 trips on a weekday is what we would run based on our assumptions. Service hours, so these are the number of hours the bus is on the street. They're obviously, the longer the route, the more buses it takes to run it. Pretty simple math, I think everyone gets that. You can see our route distance varies quite a bit. So, by not going all the way out to Gordon Road, we're at a route that's ranging from 6 to 7 miles. Adds about a mile going by way of the hospital. And then if we go all the way out to Gordon Road, you're adding almost 2 miles to that route length. So going to 8 or 9 miles. Okay, so there's some expense in terms of how this is going to cost to operate it when you start looking at how much further these things are. So we look at our passengers. So we're looking at, kind of these 2 core transit performance measures, passengers per mile and passengers per hour. So we're ranging from about 1.2 passengers per mile on the Gordon Road, bypassing the hospital route, 17 per hour. Our best one ends up being via the hospital terminating at Salem Church at 1.56 passengers per mile or 20 passengers per hour. 20 passengers per hour is not a bad number. That's a pretty good number, especially in a suburban environment like this. So we look annually, because weekends people don't ride as much as on the weekday. They don't come out as well, but you can see no real change in terms of, when we look at this option 3, serving the hospital but ending at Salem Church, still ends up being the best at 15 passengers per hour, 1.19 per mile. So now we have to talk about operating costs. So we looked at several different systems, as you can see. As a point of comparison, Fred, from their transit development plan, is at $93.80 per hour. Transit tends to measure costs in terms of what it costs per hour, because if you ever go to charter a bus, they're going to quote you a cost per hour. The driver is what generates the expense more than anything else, so they tend to think in terms of hours. PRTC, something happened in the federal reporting, so please don't pay attention to that data because it just doesn't make sense. We can't get to the bottom of it, but just there, as though you know that we did look at it. But so what we saw, we looked at the federal reports. The National Transit Database does allow us to look at bus rapid transit as a unique mode, and so we can isolate those costs. So down in Richmond, the Pulse is costing $97.06 an hour, so not too far off from Fred. Big thing to think about the difference in these costs are Fred is using what's called a cutaway vehicle. They're smaller vehicles. They don't have an expensive driver because they're not as big of a vehicle. Anyone else that I'm going to show you here is using anywhere from a 35-foot to a 60-foot transit bus. So big, heavy-duty buses meant to last 12 years versus those cutaways that you're lucky if you get 6 years out of them. And drivers would, of course, have to have a full CDL, air brake qualified, and all that. So if you're not driving a bus, you're driving a truck, and you can make a lot of money driving a truck, so they tend to make a decent amount of money. So we looked at Fort Collins. They were at $111 an hour. The Rapid up in Grand Rapids is also fairly similar size, because we looked at things that were less than 10 buses in service, and they were very cheap at $84.88 in comparison. We thought that was a bit of an outlier. So we stuck with the Richmond at $90.
We like cheap.
So when we add all that up, that means that there's an annual operating cost of somewhere, in option 1 of $1.9 million a year. Our higher ridership option, or the better ridership per mile and per hour option of 3 was $2.2 million a year. And you can see here the cost of doing those extra 2 miles over to Gordon Road, right? So you're going to add about $400,000 to $500,000 a year to get at that extra 75 passengers at that park and ride lot. Everyone with me still?
The operating cost is a function of how many buses you have running, which is a function of the headways and the span of service and all of those other metrics. So in your final recommendations, you may change those metrics, so we may be able to get away with 1 less bus, which actually reduces those numbers quite a bit.
Yep. Yeah, so there's a few things that can change these numbers. One, the length of the route, the span of the service, you know, from when it starts to when it ends, how frequently it runs, and that for the weekday versus the Saturday versus the Sunday. So as I said, when we bring all this together, what we'll come back to you with is probably something that runs a lot less often on the weekends. That's going to drop the expense, and I'll show you some phasing that we're recommending.
So the cost may be a bit less than what's there now.
Correct.
Well, and also, I mean, there's a trade-off. If you want to go high on the capital costs, maybe do some big engineering solutions at intersections to speed up the service, you can bring down the operating costs because you're running, you can go from end to end faster than.
You could, but I would also say, Nick, that looking at this, again, it's a 6 to 7, 6 to 9.
Yeah, I know there's probably not much you can do to.
You're not going to save that much, and at this cost.
$1 million on improvements.
Right.
You're going to be spending 100 years or more trying to pay it off.
Yeah, what's the estimated run time for all the options?
Yeah, give or take half an hour.
Half an hour, okay.
So one of the measures that we like to look at is cost per passenger. You know, how much are you going to pay for each trip somebody rides? So you can see that the cheapest is actually just going downtown to Salem Church, not going by the hospital, but not quite the second cheapest. The cheapest is this hospital run at $652, bypassing the hospital.
Per person.
$60.
So the cheapest rate to run it per person is to actually also include the hospital.
So per person, per hour, per mile have all convalesced on this option 3. So the option 3 is, to us, is the one that feels the right mix of everything in order to get there. So we were asking before, is it worth going to the hospital? We would say yes, it's worth going to the hospital. If the deviation is not big enough to drive enough new expense to not pick up those 200 passengers a day. Now, we also thought through, okay, knowing that park and ride can be a function of a lot of things in the future. So if BRE ran a lot more service, they ran all the time, all day, then a BRT that runs, or some bus line that runs all the time, all day, is going to do better with a park and ride lot at the end of it than one that's, there's a handful of trains, anything, and we have buses running all day long, right? They don't quite match up. If the park and ride lot here started charging and it was free parking out at Salem Church or Gordon Road, that would change the dynamic, as Nick alluded to. If just parking in downtown costs you money, or if parking at the hospital costs employees money, then this might look at something completely different. But at this point, that's not there. What seems to be the best ridership mix is literally just going from the VRE station to the town center, and actually would be to end at the town center. So you were asking before, is it worth getting into all that traffic in phase 2, or what we're calling phase 2 to Salem Church? Probably not in terms of ridership from day one, but if you made some improvements with some infrastructure going as a second phase, would make some sense. So we're saying, okay, let's do that as a phase, because that's going to take some infrastructure, it's going to take more money, and why not build this up first and get a good core ridership base, and then work your way west. And then lastly, we would say would be at phase 3, going all the way out to Gordon Road, because clearly that is a future opportunity. The ridership is not there today to justify that. So we paid a little bit of attention to traffic. So one of our questions was, wow, I've come out here for a day, driven up and down Cowan, it looks like a pretty good ride. Is it always that way? And yeah, turns out it pretty much is. It's not a lot of volume when you look at daily trips. You're at 15,000, then 20,000 once we get closer to all the retail and commercial development. But look at the difference when we're talking about 3, right? So this core area, 79,000. So that is a lot of traffic. That's a lot to contend with as a bus. And better, but still not great, going on out to Gordon Road. So what do we suggest for that? So I think there's 2 pieces. So one is, there's not a lot of volume, but there's enough that traffic going on in this commercial district on those boulevards that you kind of need something there. So we're recommending that you go for a signal priority. What that means is that for a bus coming through that's equipped with a transponder, that the light would hold for however many seconds you designate, so that if a bus is coming, it doesn't just miss the light, it will just make the light. In order for that design to work, that means the stop has to be on the far side of the intersection. The last thing you want is, you know, the light holds for it, but then it stops at the near side of the intersection to let people on and off the bus, and everyone's going, why is the light green? The bus isn't going to go anywhere. And so that's what we recommend there. Once we get beyond that, the thinking is to look at going through a bus and right turn lane, carrying that over to Salem Church. And then, of course, at Salem Church, you have this problem, which is probably why the traffic gets backed up, is there happens to be a historic cemetery there, so you don't have the lane there to convert today. Probably going to be a real challenge in the future, is our guess.
But that is a very small portion of that route.
Correct, and it is
a couple of 100 feet, that's all.
This little area right here. So, is it that bad? Probably not, because the bus is going to have to get left in order to turn into Salem Church anyway. So for a bus itself, it's probably not a problem. If you were thinking of something that was just going to run east-west and never get off Route 3, it would be. But since that's not what the thinking would be, it's probably okay. And then, again, to go further west and continue on those bus and right turn lanes. So you would take where those auxiliary lanes are today, you would take those and punch those through, which we understand is a project under consideration as it is.
So the partial right turn lanes now become full bus lanes with right turn lanes for the regular traffic.
Yeah.
A combination lane.
But you'd probably want, when you think that this bus is running every 15 minutes, if you had a dedicated lane for the bus, you'd be going, well, what on earth is the purpose of this lane? It's empty all the time, right? Because you'd only see a bus every 15 minutes. Nick, did you have a question?
Oh, I was just going to ask if you looked at a design that would keep the buses on the south side of Route 3 between the mall and Salem Church, just to facilitate left turns, because I see you don't recommend a signal priority for left turns onto Salem Church, and I just don't know if that would end up slowing up the route, because you're going west, you'd always be making left turns.
Yeah, and it may make sense to do there, but with the stop there, I'm not sure that it's really going to add a lot.
Okay.
Traffic in that one left, so.
Yeah.
Just one question about that, Pat. The suggestion there is that is restricted to bus and rights.
Correct.
So the project that we have that's to take the bump outs out to provide an additional through lane where we currently have rights, that would have to change in its configuration. Okay. But it would be ready.
Right.
but go ahead and take the bump out, Stephen.
That one's going to happen.
Yeah, only from an enforcement, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Physically, the infrastructure is the same.
The beauty of it is that it doesn't cost a lot of extra money to implement that. Probably just some enforcement and some paint, because the rest of it you're going to do anyway. So it's like cuts your capital cost to implement this thing quite substantially.
And I would think that the frequency would actually determine how practical that is. If it's very infrequent and people are going, there's a lane there, we can't use it, there's never a bus in it, versus there's always a bus in it and it's always stopping somewhere out here, then we don't want to use that.
Exactly.
The other thing that is not immediately evident here, which I would add, is that if you do this with bus lanes, bus and right turn lanes, there can be cars in that lane turning right. And the second thing is school buses during the morning and the afternoon should be allowed to use this lane as well. So it's not only the BRT bus every 15 minutes, it's not only the right turn cars, it's also school buses. And if, God help us, OmniRide decides to bring their bus further south, the OmniRide bus could also ride in, or some other commuter bus that Spotsylvania County might have in mind could also use the bus lane. So it's a bus lane, not just a BRT lane. So another Fred bus, for example, might jump in that lane as well. So it would be a bus lane, not just for the BRT. Any bus, effectively, that is transporting public people could go in the BAT lane.
Other questions?
That's what I would anyway put in to add to what you're doing, is to say that other publicly run buses could also use that particular lane.
And that's not uncommon. So for instance, Miami, when they built their southern BRT line, which is actually an abandoned railroad line. So it's not just a dedicated lane, it's actually a separate parallel roadway to US 1. Any Miami-Dade Transit bus can ride in there, so you'll see not just the BRT bus.
Any day of the week, you can see the yellow school buses stuck on Route 3 that are struggling to get through and deliver kids to school, and so that would help them.
This is Michelle. Was there any consideration
questions on the
since
BRT?
we just...
Sorry, speak up.
In terms of volume,
This is Michelle.
I'll get it here.
I just had a quick question about, since we just are taking the bump outs out now as part of the revenue sharing project, was there any consideration to traffic analysis for putting the traffic that we're putting in that fourth lane back into 3 lanes?
Could you just repeat that just one more time? Sorry, the sound quality wasn't good.
I said, since we're taking the bump outs out on Route 3 to put, 4 through lanes of traffic, was there consideration of putting future year traffic back into 3 lanes? Any analysis of that?
I think what she's alluding to is maybe the roadway portion of the study.
Yeah.
And what? I'm sorry?
I mean, I think that she's saying VDOT's getting ready to widen the road to 4 lanes to deal with all the traffic out there. If we're now converting one of those 4 through lanes to a bus-only lane, how is that going to impact the traffic on those other 3
Absolutely.
lanes?
We talked about that in our check-in meetings as well, and that'll be part of our analysis. Thank you.
I guess, is that what you were saying, Michelle?
Yes, thank you, Alex.
Okay, thank you. All right, so the second piece is looking at transit center for downtown Stafford. So the first thing we started with is, okay, so what does a transit center have to do? What are the functions of a transit center? What would you use it for in downtown Stafford? So there are a few different uses for one. One is, because it's been constructed already, is a park and ride lot for commuter buses. So if you have commuter buses going up to the Pentagon and DC, it's a place to intercept people before they get on 95 and continue, take the bus instead. It would also could be a turnaround point for local buses. So, when you have a bus and it's on a regular route, at some point it's got to turn around to go back in the other direction. You need to have a place for the bus to sit for a few minutes to catch up on its schedule and for the driver to get a break, which means if the driver gets a break, that means he needs a place to take the break. So a restroom, break room type of facility has to be provided as well. Another function is it can be a transfer point for connecting passengers, which is usually the point of a transit center, is so that, passengers are going to go from one bus to another bus. If it's a rail mode involved, then transferring to the train. But in this case, transferring between buses, that could be between local buses, it could be between local buses and an express commuter bus. It could be any type of combination of that. So when you have a transfer point, there's different things you can want. You could go back to this other slide. And you could see, this is the park and ride facility that's there now, and you could say, doesn't look too bad for a bus to pull over, but I don't see any place for the operator, and I don't know that if it was August, I'd be wanting to sit out in one of those glass ovens waiting for the next bus to come. So probably not the greatest transfer center, right? It's not someplace you're going to want to wait and do that. So you're generally going to want something that's got some sort of HVAC in it. That's enclosed for someone to wait, like you think of a train station, right? You tend to think that. And real-time information of, if I'm waiting for another bus, I want to know when the heck it's going to show up. So, want real-time information. And then there's this other function that we tend to forget about, which is just raising transit's profile within the community. So if transit's tucked away in the back corner, out of the way, it's out of sight, out of mind, and I don't even think of it as being a viable mode of transportation because I can't even find it. So there is sort of this, okay, where is it going to be in the community? And that other drawing I have here, this is actually from my favorite transit design handbook. It's in San Diego. No, I had nothing to do with it. I just really like it. But it's from San Diego MTS. But this is what they show as, this is our template in order to create a transit center. This is the footprint for it. So in Memo 4A, staff looked at 4 locations. We understand that there could be some other locations, and so we're working towards that. We will include those in there as well. But we started with these 4 points. You can see that, we've got one, which is the existing park and ride location. It's a nice looking facility, brand new. We have one over here at Courthouse where it makes the new turn. And then another one, number 3, right behind it in green. And then we have one over by basically all the municipal complex, which we show as number 4. We drew a quarter-mile radius around each of these, that convenient walk, and you can kind of see that, well, none of these cover all of the downtown Stafford development, which is all this colored stuff. Let alone, you can't see it because we got our picture here, but the hospital's over here. So you can't quite make the hospital either, right? It's going to be a bit of a walk to do that. So there is no magic bullet in any of this to say, that's the one, everyone can get everywhere they need to go, perfect location. We didn't come up with one of those. So then we thought, okay, me being, an operations planner, I think, well, what's the bus have to do? So let's talk about what we're going to make these buses do. So first thing I talked about functionality is a commuter bus. What is it going to do? Well, kind of doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure it out. It wants to get onto 95 as quickly as possible to get up to the Pentagon in DC, right? It doesn't want to have to go through meandering a whole bunch of streets. And if you've ever seen one of those coach-type buses, you probably wouldn't want it coming around on your street, let alone any kind of local street. You go, keep that thing out of here. It's big, it's noisy, it's way out of scale. So, number 1 location probably would be this park and ride lot as it exists, right? It's a nice intercept point, goes right there. But you can see location 2 would possibly work very well. Now, if this is the end of the line for that bus, and it's not going to go anywhere further south, it's just going to end here, well, guess what? It doesn't quite matter as much because it's not trying to go anywhere else. So, yeah, you'd probably want to just end it at this park and ride, but it's not really going to be a problem even if you brought it all the way out to this location or, for that matter, anywhere within this development. Okay, it really wouldn't matter. But if we're going to go further south, because we just talked about 2 other park and ride locations down on 3, start thinking a little bit different, right? So you wouldn't really want a bus to have to stop here and go out, or have to go all the way down here just to come back to 95. And you might say, oh, well, what about a nice loop? You could do this. Yeah, you could, but there's probably not enough market to justify doing that. These things really do live and die by the park and ride market. So then we thought, okay, well, there's the local bus function. So what's Fred doing? So these gold lines are what Fred's doing today. So you can see they come through the courthouse and the municipal complex where they come back over to US 1. But that's all they're doing right now. They go up to Garrisonville, they go down to Fredericksburg. So we thought, okay, well, the easy way, right, would be, well, let's just do this loop. In which case, either locations 2, 3, or 4 would all work just fine for that. That wouldn't be bad. But, again, there's all this development, and you can see what these buses are doing, right? They're kind of going through here, coming down here, then they're weaving in to get to the hospital and then going down. So imagine you're on a bus going from Garrisonville to Fredericksburg. I guarantee by the time you're at this hospital, you're going to get, I am never going to get there. This is taking too stinking long. Get it, right? You're not going to ride it unless you absolutely had to. So what's more likely to be needed in the future? It's going to be, rethink this network, okay, and think of it as a network. So you have this massive development coming in as a new downtown, probably going to have buses radiating through this downtown. And that's going to be what's driving, hey, how am I going to get to the hospital? Well, there's a bus that comes from Fredericksburg there. There's a bus that comes from wherever this transit center is there. We start thinking about, okay, where should that transit center be for these things to connect? Well, here or here makes sense. But gosh, if you're up here, you're not really going to be able to fan out as well. You're going to have a lot of buses trying to cut through different places and trying to do that. The other thing to point out is if you're going to do this, you've got to identify a route that's going to, whatever route it's going to be, that's going to go through the development so that it can accommodate buses. Remember, buses take wider turns. Buses require wider lanes. You know, you usually want at least 11 feet, if not over 12 width. And you need heavier pavement because buses tear streets up. So you got to have a heavier pavement. If you've ever been to one of the parking lots that a transit system has got a right to go through, you'll quickly see that pavement gets chewed up pretty quick if they don't have an agreement to redo it. So then we thought, okay, well, what if we put all this together? So we've got our little transit network locally fanning out. We've got our future express buses going north and south on 95. We pull it together, and you really are looking at something in here, right? It's kind of a no-brainer when we layer these all together. Something closer to 95, so the express buses can do what they need to do, and the ability for the local buses to fan out and serve the area. So then we looked at, okay, well, what's that corner look like? And I don't think the picture does it justice, but, you know, we thought about, well, you know what would make sense, because this location one is so far back off of the courthouse, like, can't we just bring it forward? Well, there's a good reason why wasn't built right forward, is because there's a heck of a grade. So you would have to come up with some sort of vertical circulation for people to get up and down. There's not really room to build this transit center to put things in. But not as difficult to fix. But this is the nice thing about buses. You can just put a stop at that intersection and then have the transit center behind it. So if I want to get off to go somewhere locally, I can. And if I need to transfer buses, I just stay on the bus, go to the nice facility, and do that. Now, we also look at it and go, well, you know, there's a lot going on here. And one stop really isn't going to do it, right? So we talked about this raising the profile of transit within the community. It's probably not just a transit center over here. It probably also means having some form of station that's at the hospital, somewhere in the central of downtown, and somewhere up at the courthouse. So it's probably not just this one investment. It's probably 3 or 4 investments to make this really work and be something where people go, yeah. Downtown Stafford, there's transit service there. I know I can get a bus there, and I can go do what I need to do. And again, make sure the streets can accommodate them as well. So thinking through that routing will make a lot of sense. So then we think, what can a transit center be? So, you know, you might have a certain image of that being around here. So if you've been to Salem Church, I didn't expect it to look like what it does. So probably not what you want to think of as the ideal transit center. There's the Fred Center, which, you know, it's nice in terms of the waiting room and all, but for bus functionality, it was really designed for an intercity terminal, because transit buses, generally by rule, they usually have an operating rule, are not allowed to back up. And so here, you have to pull in and back up. Costs a lot of time. Buses don't have a lot of visibility. You're asking for trouble when you have a design like this. And then, of course, we have the park and ride lot that's out there now. It's kind of a nice facility in terms of a nice big place. It could serve about 4 buses. When we thought this through in this little connecting network, we're thinking it probably needs to be able to accommodate 5 to 6 buses, allowing a little room for growth. And there's this beautiful facility you can see in this picture on the right. This is from Tahoe City. It's their transit center. You can see it's got a nice waiting room. It's got restrooms. It actually is a park and ride facility. You can kind of see some of that out there. But it's a beautiful facility. It's something that certainly strives to put there. And you look at this, to me, I look at this and go, yeah, I could see waiting there. I never see waiting there, but I think I could wait for a bus there.
For those of us at the back of the room, we can't quite see, but I've seen the picture before. The Salem Church Road Park and Ride lot, that waiting center shelter has been vandalized, so it's covered in graffiti and broken stuff, so it's not in good shape. You can't quite see it here from the back of the room, though.
Well, when you see it up close on your screen. Anyway, it needs some love. So that's the transit center. And then we also think about transit stations. So one that I was involved in, so full disclosure, when I was in Jacksonville, we created our own standards after looking at San Diego's. And this was actually in a mall called the River City Marketplace. The developer actually built and paid for that. So there's actually 2 of these in the mall with key centers where the buses come. But you can see it's something substantial. It's got a nice information kiosk. You can say, hey, you know, I can see catching a bus here. This is in Orlando, the downtown Orlando BRT system has these dedicated stations. You can see they're a little more substantial than what you might see. This is actually near where I live in Montgomery County, Maryland. You can kind of see that. It's kind of got architecturally fancy, but basically, you know, there's ways to do this that transit gets some prominence where it is, and it's not just what we think of normally of the pole in the ground with a metal sign.
We got a lot of that, yeah.
All right, and that's really it. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now, and thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I just wanted to read off a couple of a comment and a question from online people. So the comment is there would need to be significant education, service announcements, advertising to the community to understand not just the service, but the dedicated lane as a whole new concept of service first. And again, as a transit rider, the breakdown in GRTC service seems to be related to not being able to find drivers, since the driver was eaten up by a passenger, not too surprising. Have autonomous vehicles made enough headway to be considered for BRT, especially considering that drivers is the main power leader?
Okay, so 2 good points. So one, yes, anything like this is going to take a lot of education, right, and a lot of marketing. And, you know, that's usually why they do have their own fancy brands. It's very consistent. If you've ever noticed, you know, general transit system, you know, when I first went to work for a transit system, which was Jacksonville, Florida, I can remember the general manager say, why do we need to advertise? They see the bus going up and down the street. Well, that doesn't work. But, I mean, there is that attitude out there. So it is a product or a service. It has to be marketed and advertised. If you don't do it, then you're not going to get the ridership. So excellent point there. And then certainly something like the BAT lanes is going to take an awful lot of education because people just aren't used to doing that. So it takes enforcement as well that Becky mentioned as well. The second piece, sorry.
About autonomous vehicles.
Autonomous vehicles. So I don't know if anyone's seen the state of the art of the autonomous vehicle. They're very small and they're very slow. So they can basically have a bench seat about this wide on one side and another one on this side, a center aisle with a door on each, and that's what you got. So you can sit maybe 6 to 8 people, and maybe you can get an equal number standing, but they're very, you would not want to be in a vehicle that's that crowded, and they're very slow, meaning they top out somewhere around 15 miles an hour. So these are not rapid at all. They're most appropriate for working in individual development or something like some immediate connection. The technology is changing. I will say it was back in the 90s when we brought over a demonstration bus from Europe that was supposed to have automatic docking. And so the bus would, you know, basically the driver wouldn't have to try to get up close to the curb. There was a line painted in the strip, and there was an optic reader in the bus, and it would follow that line. And there was talk that, well, we can do that anywhere and do the whole thing forever. That hasn't happened yet. And that was in the 90s, so you can see how long it's taking that technology to develop. So I think, yes, it's a real possibility in the future, but I think that future is still pretty far away. There is a nationwide shortage in bus operators, and it's in part because, you know, being a bus operator is not fun. And, I mean, they're long hours. It's a seniority system, so you end up being on call for your first 5 years or whatever of your career. And systems that run 7 days a week, that in 24 hours a day, that means, guess what? You're the junior employee. You're working in the middle of the night on Saturday night. It's not something a lot of people want to do, so it is a problem.
Chris, just in terms of context of the transit center in Stafford, the reason why FAMPO staff really wanted to focus on this is because there isn't an obvious comfortable place for people to transfer between buses in Stafford. And as Fred looks at their route redesign, as we think about the fact that we're going to have to get in the future from this new Stafford downtown that's been conceived of and will slowly be built over time, we will need to get from there to the VRE station at Brook. We may see commuter buses, either OmniRide or somebody else wanting to pick up people in this area. And because this is a newly developing town center that will develop over time, if you don't allocate the space for your transit center now, and you try and retrofit it 20 years from now, you're going to pay a lot of money to get the land or the space to be able to do it. So the idea here is that we try to identify this space and work on constructing a transfer center now so that over the next 10 years or 15 years we can do this, and then it doesn't cost the massive amount of money it would cost 15 years from now. So what we're trying to do is prepare for the future now so we don't get caught out later and then VDOT says, the cost of purchasing land is prohibitive, we can't do it. Well, let's prevent it being prohibitive by taking action now. So that's the rationale behind doing this. I know that folks from Stafford are here, and we have shown the presentation to one or two staff at Stafford, and they might wish to give us some comments. I know they had some suggestions of maybe an alternative site or two that should also be looked at, but I won't speak for Stafford.
I know we do have some county-owned property up there in the northern portion of the downtown Stafford, across from our government center courthouse complex there, but I'm unsure what future plans we have for that. I know we're looking at doing some parking lots or something like that. Is there any thought to having, like, since it's still conceptual for the downtown Stafford, having a centralized transfer station that might be able to get your quarter-mile, like, walking distance to envelop the hospital and that, Mary Washington satellite campus that's over there as well?
Yeah, and so it's a good point. And, one of the challenges, there is, like I said, there's no quarter-mile radius that serves everything. You could put something down here to get to the hospital, but then the courthouse starts to fall out of that area. So it doesn't ever come together. And like I said, I think, there isn't one be-all, end-all. And so that's why we're coming up saying you probably really need to look at multiple locations to do what you want to do. It would be part of a network. It's not going to be a route doing a thing if this is going to work well. Go ahead, Nick.
Can I ask a question? Maybe this is more a question for Stafford County, but I know that the original alignment of Courthouse Road went underneath 95 there, and it looks like there's still some openings, bridges that were built. In all but one, I think the southbound ramp does not have a bridge.
That's correct.
But to me, just on paper, that looks like a tremendous opportunity for a future transit-only connection between a transfer center on the east side of the highway and maybe, transit routes that would fan out to the west to more of the residential area. So I don't know if that's something that has been discussed, I'm just curious as to why there wasn't an underpass built on that last ramp when it was constructed a couple years ago.
Cost.
Okay.
Mainly at the time. We had explored even for a possible pedestrian or emergency services access and providing that at the time. Yeah. And in talking with the contractor, they wanted the county to shell out over $1 million to install this, culvert or underpass there, and we just didn't have the funding available to do it. So.
Yeah, because I think that might be an interesting option to reduce the travel times and also the operating times to reduce the operating costs. If buses need to do an east-west, to not have to pull out, make 3 right-hand turns, and go across the highway and stop at lights and all that stuff. So, we've already got the infrastructure there, like it's 3/4 of the way built. So.
I did actually have a question. I'm with Stafford County Planning and Zoning. I'm part of our long-range division, but we had concerns. Now, I wanted to focus on you brought up the possibility of providing additional stop locations within the downtown area. Now, I assume you're referring to additional stops, either part of existing routes or potentially new routes coming in later. Okay. Primary concern. One of our our growing concerns is that we have a growing development area actually south of the hospital. We've got relatively new, the Aberley apartment complex that's down there. We've got a new apartment complex coming in directly across from that, and about 212 single-family homes even further south. And I can't remember, I think it's a Germanic campus that is actually going to be in that same general area as well. And then as you get a little closer to Eskimo Hill, we've got more growing single-family development down there as well. So there was a concern as far as potentially placing this transit center in proximity to those areas, but obviously I think what I was understanding is it sounds that may be the need for expanding additional freight routes to those areas, which would in turn be serviced by that transit center at a later date.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, before you say anything on that, I have a question for Stafford County. We're talking now in those comments about places around here. Does the county own any land here?
Not that I'm aware of. I have to go and check our GIS, but I don't believe we own any land right along the new located courthouse road there.
So this is a direct route straight onto the I-95. So if forgive me for interfering in your carefully laid plan, but if that is not great for you and you wanted it here, the question is the land. The whole reason we're doing this is exactly that, long-range planning. We want this to work in the future for future people to use. And so the idea is to try and find that land now. So if you in long-range planning or Alex have identified one spot somewhere down here that is close to this main drag straight back to the I-95, but also US 1 down to the city of Fredericksburg, that would be a great spot. But we're not aware of a piece of land that could work is the problem.
As far as I know, I think the only county-owned property in the area is primarily along the existing old courthouse alignment, pretty much right in the same vicinity of the courthouse and the government center. Pretty much directly across the street from where the government center is currently.
So I guess with the timeline that BHP are working to, now would be a good time to find that out. So in the next kind of, how long?
2 weeks or so.
The next 2 weeks, because they want to finish up their analysis and draw the final transit report for us. So in the next 2 weeks, if you could find anything in this vicinity that they could model, that would complete that study quite nicely.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, that would be helpful. And Ian's right. You know, if we had something in here, that certainly would work from a FRED network. As I said, going up this way, not too bad for a commuter route either. So anything right in this intersection of US 1 and Courthouse would probably make sense, especially if all that development is coming to the south. But again, you know, it would not negate the need for doing these other stations throughout the area.
So I just have a quick question. Spotsylvania County long-range planning on my end. For this project, is this development that we're seeing here already enabled? I mean, is it zoned, or does it have to go through zoning to get to this?
Pretty much most of the area of the downtown Stafford, I'm going to say in the southwest quadrant of Route 1, right there at the old courthouse alignment and Route 1 between the new, and it's actually Hospital Center Boulevard extended. That has already been rezoned, and I believe the current zoning now is it's our UD, Urban Development Zoning District.
Okay, so some of the opportunities for land may have kind of that ship sailed.
Potentially.
In terms of like a proffer or something, okay.
That's why we'd like to know soon if there is any piece left that we could still model. We want to try and help you and FAMPO help FAMPO to try and plan this future, because sooner or later, if we follow this process, the next step is we design something, and then the step after that is, you know, help you get the funding to actually construct the thing, which not that we've got all the money lying around ready to do it, but FAMPO does have processes to help facilitate all these things, including a BRT or a transit center, or those 13 roadways that we're going to have to look at some improvements to. So we want to think about that.
And I think too, don't lose sight again of the roadway requirements. So if you end up, you know, working with Fred on the re-envisioning their network, you know, if there's need for north-south access through here or other east-west access, definitely think through, okay, how are buses going to have to turn and how are they going to make it through there? Nothing worse than someone comes up with this beautiful pedestrian-friendly thing and then it has to get cut out because the buses can't make the turn and are running over the curb all the time.
So what I guess I'm hearing is that we would like one transit center with a bunch of ancillary bus stops to pick up on the routes that are going to connect at that transit center.
Yeah, and again, stations, not stops.
Okay.
Not like that. You'll probably have lots of these in.
We don't want a pole.
Yeah, you're gonna have a lot of poles.
We want something more substantial than a pole. Thanks.
And that happens a lot, too often, you know, we build everything and then, oh, you know, the transit system just wants to put up one of those metal and glass shelters and they can't find the spot because there's utilities at every intersection, they can't move the boxes and everything.
So on our agenda for today, the next item is to have discussion on these two items. Now, some of the discussion we've been having during the course of this, so I don't want to belabor it. I don't need to speak for the sake of speaking, but if somebody wants to make additional comments on either the BRT proposals or on the transit center in Stafford, please have at it, and then I'll close that portion and we can move on to the next step.
There were some comments online again. So just about the Salem Church Road shelter, apparently that's owned by VDOT. Not sure.
VDOT's here.
We'll be sure to check that out. And also a suggestion that the consultants ride the route so they can get a better understanding of the needs of the community when it comes to ridership. Yeah.
Okay.
We did drive the route with the consultant, but any further question or comment on these two projects from anybody?
How complex would it be to retrofit the existing Central station to accommodate rapid transit buses?
So, good question. Let me go back to that picture. That's probably the best thing to talk from. So, for rapid transit, we actually, when we looked at the route, we actually think it'd be better to keep them out on the street rather than trying to bring them through here, because it's fairly narrow. The turn works for these smaller buses, but a full-size bus, I'm not sure you could make a right turn into the facility. So that would mean that it would be really cumbersome to have to do some double looping in order to get in. There is not room in the facility property itself to retrofit it to do sawtooth bays. There's just not enough room.
The last phase of the study, we've set aside some funding for VHB to do some engineering work at the end. So we first want to get, like, what are the choices, what are we going to pick, what are we happy with, get the public input on this before we do any, like, heavy engineering work. But right at the end of the study, there is money set aside for VHB to take the final agreed solution and to do some engineering work and so on trying to solve that sort of problem. Where should the bus stop at that particular point? And there is money set aside to do some of that work.
Great, thank you.
But at the end, so you won't see that until much later.
For what it's worth, Ms. Spotsylvania, I thought your phase seemed to make sense to me, the phase 2 to Salem Church and 3 further west.
I want to say this now. I've held back from saying it until now. I actually like a two-phase solution, going out to Salem Church Road in phase 1, and then going out to the second VDOT park and ride lot at Gordon Road in a phase 2. So have a two-phase rather than a three-phase. VHB prefers a three-phase. So, you know, I'm giving you space to disagree with both of them, but that's just my personal view. Yeah, some phases I think are probably useful. Any other comments on these, or can I move on? Great. All right. Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about what we're going to do now to get towards the transit report and recommendations, and then the roadway steps and the roadway stuff that we're going to do, just at a high level so we know what to expect. Our next meeting is in August, and what should we be preparing for in August to hear from you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first item A on the agenda is really where do we go from what Daryl just presented to a final report and recommendations. We are scoped to assist Ian and FAMPO
in developing materials and presenting both to the TAC and to the policy committee. Are those scheduled as of right now?
We haven't scheduled the date, but I need to talk urgently to you about those dates.
Okay, great. So those would be the next steps. In the meantime, we also will be providing assistance to Coley. And does everybody know Coley? Is Coley? Okay, great. They will be leading the cause as far as the public outreach component. I'm not sure exactly what yet is. Did you want to say?
Sure, yeah. There is a plan, and we'll be setting up tables, some farmers markets, and along the routes. So anywhere that's along that route that we
available.
Yeah, and some surveys will go out, QR codes, all this stuff.
And bulk emails to our database and that kind of thing. So Coley has worked on a plan to present this to the public so we can get public comment, because I know when you start with BRTs, you have to get public input and you've got to document that and show what you did, and Coley's working on a plan to do all of that.
Right. Sorry to put you on the spot.
Oh, no.
And of course, VHB will be along the ride to assist in that effort, but that is being led by FAMPO staff internally. The intent, obviously, is to gauge public interest, take into account their comments. That was a great comment that we just heard about suggesting that we ride the routes. Comment received. But the idea is that the final report will incorporate all of the feedback that we've received today, as well as any feedback that we receive over the course of the next month or so, both from this stakeholder committee as well as from the public, and then wrap that into any final analysis tweaks that we may need to make. We appreciate any information we get in the very near future on potential land availability for the stations that Daryl was describing, potentially closer to the Route 1 courthouse intersection. So again, that will be wrapped into the more immediate tweaks on that analysis. But the idea is that we would have a final report with those recommendations in the early part of July. So about 2 months from now is when that final report would be available. Now, again, this is still just a high-level overview of the recommendations as far as a, what are we calling it now? Daryl, if it's not BRT, it's not BRT light, more priority transit. Priority transit, as well as the location of the transit center or station or combination of multiple of those two entities.
I think we should call it the Rappahannock Raptor.
So that will all be put on that in July, but then as Ian alluded to, there is a follow-up step that will occur later in which we would do a little bit more of a deeper dive into some of the engineering. When I say engineering, we're talking about sort of a smart scale readiness, which isn't to say that smart scale is the only or the most appropriate funding mechanism for any of these transit related, certainly one option. But what we would be doing is, say, like a 10% or a 30% preliminary engineering effort. We would be looking into issues associated with right-of-way, utilities, and then a engineering cost estimate that would pass the scrutiny of a smart scale evaluation. And again, there are other federal programs that might be more viable alternatives for those funding strategies. And that's part of what we would be doing at that time too, is thinking through strategy as far as how to get from this planning phase closer to an implementation phase. Any questions on the schedule associated with this transit piece of the broader phase 2 study? All right, great. Well, that satisfies part A of that agenda. Part B was just to give a very high overview of the other piece of phase 2. And let me step back by saying that Daryl is leading the transit, and that's why he was up here presenting all of that information. His counterpart, our colleague Nat Greer, is leading the roadway and active transportation analysis. We also have on board our sub-consultant, RSG, to help us with some of the TDM, the modeling that we will be doing to integrate the strategies that we may develop for the 13 corridors and then include those into a model run that would give us a better sense of how any improvement measures that we would propose would impact mobility, congestion on the whole. Just look on the screen. Just as a reminder, because I haven't memorized all of the corridors, but the 13 corridors have been identified. I think everybody's aware of what those are, but just as a reminder, both obviously Route 3, we spent a lot of time already talking about Route 3. There was a great comment that came across over the phone as far as what the impacts to Route 3 would be of the bat lanes, and of course that would be part of that analysis, as well as just more general analysis, high-end overview and study of what we might do to reduce those congestion choke points. The 13 most congested corridors have already been identified as part of Phase 1. So Route 3, Courthouse Road, Spotsylvania 208, as well as Courthouse Road in Stafford County, Cowan, Mills, Butler, Fall Hill, Raymond Church, Mountain View, Garrisonville, Truslow, and Warrenton. So all of those have been identified, reported, they're documented elsewhere. And Kellogg Mill was the last one. So those are the 13 corridors that we'll be investigating. There is a first step will be to engage our colleagues, RSG, to what we're calling a validation memo. We're not doing a massive comprehensive recalibration of the model. We're taking the model components that we've been given already and just doing an overview and a gut check, as well as develop some of the metrics that we will be using for how we evaluate any proposed improvements, congestion reduction measures that we might take on any of these 13 corridors. Again, holistic approach to congestion in the region. We may be looking at new access points, interchanges, ramps to from I-95, for example. It plays very well into that pipeline study that Ian alluded to earlier, the VDOT Commission study Stephen is leading. I happen to be leading that study for VHB. As Ian mentioned, not to focus too much on Route 3, but there has been a lot of focus on 3 to date, is that we really are looking for measures to remove some of the demand from Route 3 on that eastern portion of it, because we've just run out of what I call the Band-Aid solutions of retiming or even removing certain movements, reinvestigating lane uses, things of that measure. We're now talking about removing demand or adding capacity. And adding capacity, we've discussed some of those measures. It's a major undertaking. None of the initially suggested improvements as part of the pipeline studies moving forward with this smart scale, but there's some ideas that are there. They're percolating, and will be further investigated as part of this east-west mobility study. Again, holistically, in conjunction with investigating those 12 other corridors. But looking at new interchange ramps at Harrison potentially, as well as north closer to the baseball stadium. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, just 2 quick comments. The one is just vis-a-vis a comment we did get from VDOT. The congested roads that were identified are not necessarily the most congested right now today. This is a look out to 2050 using the VDOT travel demand model, and it identifies those as the most congested spots in the region by 2050, assuming we build all the things that are currently in the long-range transportation plan. So if we build those things in the long-range transportation plan, we are still going to have congestion on these 13 roads. And the question is why and where. And so VHB is going to be looking at where and why and trying to come up with solutions that we can add to what we've already done to try to prevent those becoming bottlenecks or whatever the problem is. I don't know what the problem is. We hired the experts to find out what the problem is. That's the one comment. The other comment is something that has just struck me now, and we'll need to confirm this offline, is I remember with Alex, we swapped out one of the congested roads for Enon, am I right? We decided to put Enon in and remove one of those very minor roads, and I'm just not sure that the list you've read out now is that. So the revised list you may not have, it's not a recently revised list, it was done kind of 4 or 5 months ago, but I just want to double check with you offline that 13th road, you've got the correct one, because I hope to God you haven't got the pre-revised list which might have been a communication.
I was reading off of the older list, thank you, but we did discuss that during our internal kickoff meeting with you.
So the one is swapped for Enon?
Yes. Yep. Thank you for making that distinction. I think it was actually Kellogg we switched because that was more of a north-south.
Correct. So we pulled off Kellogg and we replaced it with Enon. So I just want to make sure your sub-consultant knows that we don't have a whoopsie later because I forgot or somebody forgot to.
No, and that's great. And in full transparency, the roadway is intentionally lagging a little bit behind. We wanted to focus on the transit piece. So RSG is, they're just getting moving now on that modeling with the intent of getting to a similar position by that next August date, the next time that this group would convene to come together with some initial recommendations about, as you pointed out, Ian, identifying some of the root causes of the congestion in 2050, good distinction as well. So that date in August is when we would be presented similarly on what the roadway improvements might be.
So the next meeting in this room, August the 22nd, we're going to get a presentation on those 13 roadways by VHB to tell us initial comments on these is what we think the problems are, and this is what we think we need to do.
That's absolutely right. That then would be followed by a similar public outreach component led by FAMPO again, and reporting out to both the TAC and the policy committee, dates to be determined in the future. So it's following a very similar process of this transit piece, just lagging slightly behind so that we're focused. I mentioned the active transportation component, as did Ian earlier. So the active transportation improvements, there are a couple of them that we're looking at associated with the roadway, kind of lump those together, and primarily concerning alternative modes, foot, bike, et cetera, non-vehicular access to the train stations in Stafford County and Spotsylvania County. So connections to the nearby shared use paths, trails, et cetera. How do we get connections where right now there are some broken connections, especially over major roadways.
And Germanna College might be happy if they remember that we did look at connecting from the Germanna College down to the Spotsylvania train station via an east-west connection for bike and pedestrians, as well as encouraging Fred in their transit study to look at a transit connection to the Spotsylvania train station. So we are considering Germanna's needs as well and the students' needs there.
Comment, question, has the region invested in trail counters to get hard data for the analysis? And there's a great study linked from the other region. They had trail counters that could help interpret Strava and streetlight data.
The answer is yes. Both VDOT's Northern Virginia office have placed a counter in the region, and FAMPO has a counter which we move from location to location to capture that data. And Carrie Barber is not in the room right now, but she's running with that program. So yes, we do.
The Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee just recently worked with Terry to identify some new sites for this year, actually, for placing counters. So it's a work in progress.
All right, we do have a time constraint today. Sorry to do this, but VDOT and FAMPO staff have a 3 o'clock appointment. And anyway, we normally try to not have these meetings go over 2 hours because it starts to get a little bit emotionally draining by the time you get to the end of 2 hours. So if anybody has last comments on the future steps or questions, please make them now, and then I won't kind of keep you on for longer than we need to. Any questions about the?
When will the PowerPoint be shared to the group?
So Coley, who's over there, is our public engagement officer, and she will be sending that out, and I'm sure she can do it latest by tomorrow morning. If you're lucky, you might get it this afternoon.
Thank you.
It is available. We'll put it on the website as well so that you can download it from the website, and we'll also email it out.
Yeah.
I would encourage you to share these ideas with the organizations that each of you are from. So please feel free in the next 2 weeks to send us any comments or suggestions that you might have. don't wait until August to send those, because by then we will have already produced a report that's written with nice pictures, and we don't want to have to tear it up. So if you, for example, the university and Germanna College, if you have comments, please send them to us in the next 2 weeks. Stafford County, please feel free to send us additional suggestions that we can work on. VDOT, if you've got any ideas, the city, Spotsylvania, if you have any ideas on these transit and related matters, sooner than later for your comments. We'll give you the same opportunity again on the roadway projects. We'll invite many comments on the roadway projects as well. Anything from anybody? Great. Well, thank you to VHB for coming and presenting today. Thank you to all of you giving up your hours of your day to come and participate. But I think we're building a good future for everyone. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you.